a way to travel.
Invariably, the society that it depicts for whenever the TARDIS lands in the 1970s is some kind of terrible dystopia. There's been a military coup, or fascism has taken power.
Time to find out the truth. Time to find out if the waste from your product is causing these maggots to appear.
That's enough! I warn you, Doctor, if you persist in these slanders, I shall have you restrained under the Emergency Powers Act.
You have no such right.
The necessary authority was brought to me this morning.
Quite often, Doctor Who would turn up somewhere and there'd be an external menace. There'd be a monster out there. But there'd also be some petty official who was in his way, stopping him doing anything about the monster. And the point was to sideline the job's worth and get the creature killed.
Okay, give me an hour. Give me half an hour. At least give me a chance to talk to the wretched man.
You've exactly 32.5 minutes.
Right.
I suppose the ultimate irony of this came in the 1970s, where we went back to his home planet and found that it was even worse. Yeah, it was like the worst kind of boring, fussy, class-ridden society, and that's why he'd left in the first place.
Right outside the capital itself. I'm in trouble now.
After you've arrested the personnel, impound the machine.
Of course, Castellano.
British superheroes are always middle-class professionals, from doctors to judges. The next iconic figure to emerge in British science fiction was Judge Dredd, who first appeared in the comic 2000 AD in 1977. His draconian law enforcement tactics in the dystopian Megacity 1 were an extreme satire of a police state where the word of the law controls the population mercilessly. Science fiction writers have continued to use dystopias to rage about the way the modern world is going.
I think it is disgusting. Something ought to be done soon.
And the promise I make now is inflation.
Dystopian fiction is inevitably attractive to angry writers.
We'll be fighting in the streets.
Because it allows them to express all their worst fears and all their hatreds. It is particularly attractive to older writers who are in a state of incipient despair.
Anthony Burgess was the king of the complainers. He used science fiction to lambast everything he disliked. Burgess's most famous novel, A Clockwork Orange, is a dystopian nightmare of teenage violence.
It is, on one level, a grumpy old git saying they should get their hair cut and they shouldn't play their records so loud. But on another level, it's a work of imaginative projection, in that it does get into the mind of a juvenile delinquent, of a young tearaway.
In fact, Burgess had very personal reasons for wanting to examine the mind of a teenage criminal. He had been horrified to witness the mods and rockers fighting on Brighton Beach in the 60s, but his brush with violence went even deeper. His wife had been attacked by American GIs during the war. Burgess wanted to write a book from the point of view of her attackers. In A Clockwork Orange, teenage delinquent Alex is rehabilitated after a life of vicious crime. Burgess invents the Ludovico method, a sort of aversion therapy which uses drugs and televised violence as tools of reform.
Nobody watches television in A Clockwork Orange unless they're strapped to a chair and have their eyes held open, which is quite an interesting vision of the future.
By my brothers, one vision I did not like, though, was when they put like clips on the skin of my forehead, so that my top glass lids were pulled up and up and up, and I could not shut my glazies. I tried to smack and said, "This must be a real horror show film if you are so keen on my videoing it." And one of the white coat vecs said, smacking, "Horror show is right, friend. A real show of horrors."
A Clockwork Orange, you could argue, is about generational anxiety, about a sense in which language is shifting, and he was someone who was very invested in the literary language. He saw himself as the heir to James Joyce. Absurdly.
Burgess saw himself as the literary successor to George Orwell, too. In the 1970s, he turned his attentions to writing a reply to 1984. He called his book 1985. He set out to prove that Orwell wasn't writing about the future at all. He says that everything described in 1984 was already happening when the book was written.
A lot of the things that people now think of as little bits of inventive prophecy were really inventive satires on things that were actually happening at the time. I can remember the streets of London exactly as Orwell described them. Run down and seedy, the lifts kept on failing, everything smelt of stale cabbage.
Now please, come along there. Them stewards sort them.
Even the Big Brother posters were borrowed, according to Burgess. The Bennett Correspondence College had widely billboarded a sign saying, "Let me be your big brother," at the time the book was written. Burgess decided to rewrite the novel and give his alternative vision of the 80s. According to him, Britain would be an Islamic country in the stranglehold of the trade unions. The 13th night of the general strike was a night of the big fires. Those who believed that these had been started by the sons of the Prophet were disabused by the spectacle of the bright destruction of the tall, thin building in the Strand, devoted to Islamic popular culture.
I think Anthony Burgess was asked to write 1985 precisely because he was seen as a prominent modern Orwellian writer. But it is, yes, it's just putting the boot into things that he disapproved of, including trade unions and the hordes of Islam.
I can't take Burgess as seriously as he takes himself. I think he just didn't like paying taxes, and sort of didn't like trade unionists as a class. He'd risen out of that.
As the year 1984 approached, other responses to the novel appeared. Brazil is a version of the story that pokes fun at the bureaucracy of the totalitarian state. It's a dark vision of drudgery and red tape, where people live in a state of constant fear of an unseen enemy.
I think it's kind to say that Brazil's a reworking of 1984. What it is a rip-off of 1984. I mean, it just completely steals everything from 1984 and does it again, perhaps as a nightmare comedy.
I'd say they're nearly out of the game.
For instance, the world of Brazil is hideously arbitrary as well as cruel. It's also inefficient. Yeah, the secret police are quite likely to arrest the wrong people, whereas Big Brother is actually frighteningly efficient. He knows Winston's the rebel and he gets him.
The mistakes of wrongful arrests, things not quite working, central services, everything always blowing up, and it's never them it's always someone else. There's terrorists around who are doing it. There weren't. It was just bad servicing. So, yeah, and I think and also quintessentially British, the class structure, that if you're connected, you can get on.
Brazil, like 1984 before it, took inspiration from the propaganda of Stalin's Russia.
It was kind of 40s deco-futuristic. You look in the Russian poster books, we used the colours from those posters and the starkness of them, quite bizarre qualities of them, But basically they were all posters warning you, just watch your step.
Brazil was a film I loved on release, and I loved particularly because of its sort of dirty, magical realism, if you like. The whole kind of thing about the ducts and kind of imagined, as it were, dystopic London, full of kind of writhing ducts behind every wall panel. And then I went down into the tube. I sort of almost dropped straight out of the cinema into the London tube system and saw this kind of duct coming over the wall with right at the bottom of it a little sign saying, "Speak here."